I just spent $200 plus tax on one of these rigid routers that comes with a fixed base and a plunge base and a bunch of other accessories, and I thought I'd do a short review on it. I bought yet another router because I put a big router back in my Panther router, and now I needed another big router to put back in my tilting router lift. And at the Home Depot, this was the only one with a cylindrical body and variable speed that they had, so I bought this one. The reason I'm doing a review is there's a few things about this router that I actually really like, but there's also one gotcha. The router body only has one protrusion from cylindrical, which is this alignment pin here, and it has an indent here. The pin keeps it aligned when it goes in here, and this indent is for this part here to lock it approximately at the right level. Well, it doesn't really hold that well. The idea is to get it in the right position before you lock this, and that really holds it in place. This little clamping thing needed a bit of adjustment to get it to get the right kind of hold. Like most plunge routers, the base has a bit of play, so I would never use the plunge action on this for a homemade machine of mine. But this isn't any worse than other routers I've seen. I think you'd have to go to a really expensive one to get no play in here. What's really cool about this router is the fixed base. It too has a little tab thingy here for catching in here, and this one catches much better. And then there's an adjustment screw for moving it up and down, and that seems to work pretty well. And then the clamp here, this also needed adjustment. But what's really cool is it came with this weird T-shaped piece of plastic. I thought, what the heck is this for? And I noticed there's a hex thing on the end here. And then I noticed there's a hole in here. So the idea is, if you mount this in a router table, you can still adjust the height from above the table, which is, I think, a very cool feature, because that gives you a lot of the advantages of a router lift without having to buy a router lift. So very cool design here. You do have to remember to lock it though, because this part in here really doesn't hold the router well enough, so every time you adjust it you need to unlock and then relock. This router also came with this funny pin here, which is a quarter here and half-inch here, and this weird plastic cone. And I figured these are for aligning, and indeed the manual confirms. So you put this in here, and then you put this shaft inside the collet, and then you can use the cone to line up this part. And this thing with the screws loose, this actually has quite a lot of play to it. So if we push this down, we can now tighten the screws and make sure that this plastic base is exactly concentric with the shaft of the router. For bit changes, I suppose you could just take the router out of the base and change bits that way. Or if you want to leave it mounted in a router table thing, it comes down far enough that between the spindle lock and the collet you can actually get at it up here to tighten and loosen bits, so that should work fairly well. It also comes with this dust port thingy that goes on here, and it looks like it should be fairly effective. On the other side there's a plastic cover, which of course makes it very difficult to get at it with a wrench, but if you just squeeze it, it comes off like that. So I think this is a very good design. But the big question really is, how well does this motor work? So let's try that out next. So just holding it in my hand and making adjustments to the speed control, I can tell that this router responds very crisply. Much more crisply than this cheap Mastercraft router from Canadian Tire. And also, I'm feeling much less vibrations on this one, even at full speed, compared to this one. So that's a very good sign for this one here. But here we get to the part that's really boneheaded about this one. When I looked at it in the store, I just sort of held my hand up to it like that, and I know from here to here is 8 inches, and so I was pretty confident this is about 3.5 inches, and if you're going to make it 3.5 inches, you don't want to make it almost 3.5 inches. You want to make it 3.5 inches so it fits in router lifts and stuff like that, because these all take 3.5 inch routers. But when I got it home, I put my calipers on it, and just to check it, and it lined up with an eighth mark, but it's at 3 5/8 or 92 millimeters instead of 89 millimeters or 3.5 inches. And I was first, it's like, that can't be, that's just stupid. But I measured it again, and if we take the base that fits onto this one and try that with a standard 3.5 inch router, there is quite a lot of play. So this router really is an incompatible size with most router lifts that are out there. So it's kind of ironic that I actually bought this router to use in a router lift, my tilting router lift. So I thought, well, let's see if maybe I should cut these arches out a little bit more, because the hose clamps that hold the router can be adjusted, but I thought I'd just try and fit it in there anyways. The slightly larger router body doesn't exactly match this curvature, so it's pressing more against the corners here, but that should hold it fairly rigidly in place. Now if I put the cover plate on there, you can tell the router is not quite centered, but I think it's close enough that I'll just leave it like that rather than cutting these out and then making it incompatible with other routers. I've got a precision ground 1/2 inch steel shaft that I sometimes use for checking alignment. I wanted to check how square this is, and the first thing I always do is I twist it a bit just to make sure it's not wobbling on the end. And what's impressing me here is I can hardly see this wobble, so if I put a box next to it, it's easier to see by eye, and the wobble on here is really very minimal. But what I actually wanted to check was whether this is going to be vertical here with a different size router. And it turns out if I touch on the top here, I've got a good 3 millimeters worth of gap on the bottom here. So this is not mounted entirely vertical, and I don't blame the router, it's my tilting router lift that's not that precise. So to bring the router into alignment, the top of it needs to move this way. And I've just loosened up this hose clamp, and I've got a couple of plastic shims from a 2-liter pop bottle, and I'm just going to put them in here to force the router this side this way a little bit. And now tightening up the hose clamp again. So I've still got a teeny tiny bit of gap here, but I'll call that close enough. And in this direction, I've got a teeny tiny gap at the top, but close enough. So whenever I use this large bit with the Mastercraft router, I got a lot of vibration. So let's try it with this router here. So that was one full depth cut, and that worked surprisingly well. The speed regulation is really good. The router didn't slow down at all. And even in this birch here, just a clean cut, so I'm actually very pleased with this router. That said, there is one final dislike for this router, which is that for 1/4 inch bits it comes with this collet adapter, whereas my other routers come with a whole separate collet. I think I'd very much prefer a separate collet to the adapter. So overall, I quite like this router. In fact, it's the best router I've got so far, but then again, I mostly buy cheap stuff. The only problem with it is, if you're trying to put it in a commercial router lift, it probably won't fit because of the boneheaded non-standard size. But I pay for my own power tools, so I can say what I want.